from wherever you are sitting this afternoon. It's good that you are here. On behalf of the Convocations Committee, I welcome you to this convocation in the midst of this Advent season and the nuttiness of our world. Let us pray together. Advent waiting. As we wait, may we hold the world in our hearts. As we wait, may we hold one another close. As we wait, may we be watchful, mindful, listeners for the whispers of the still small voice. As we wait, may we be at home in the darkness and all that the darkness offers. As we wait, may we fan the embers of hope, love, joy, and peace, the embers of grace and truth, the embers of justice for our wobbly, torn, beautiful world. As we wait, may we prepare ourselves to receive the child who is to come. We pray in Jesus. Amen. Our speaker has chosen the text from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, verses 15 through 22. Listen for the word of God. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words, that being Jesus. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. "Teacher," they said, "we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You are not swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought out a denarius, and he asked them, "Whose image is this and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then he said to them, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." When they heard this, they were amazed. So they left him and went away. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Our hymn this afternoon will be new to most of us. It's printed, and the words are printed on the seats as you arrived, entitled, "Is It Lawful to Pay Taxes?" How many of you have heard of this one before? I hadn't until I was looking for a special hymn for today's text. But it is written by, or the words are written by Carolyn Winfrey Gillette, and we have her permission to use this today as we open our convocation. It goes to the tune, "God Whose Giving Knows No Ending," and Judy's going to play through it once, and then we will sing all 4 verses, and as is our custom, let us remain seated. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Tommy Givens, who is professor of New Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary, where he has taught for the past 15 years. In his teaching, Tommy emphasizes the application of biblical teaching for how God's people are called to live out their witness to the gospel, especially in troubling times. In addition to New Testament studies and theological ethics, Dr. Givens' research interests include Christian nonviolence, political theory, ecology, and the scriptural reasoning for Jewish, Christian, Muslim relations. Many Monte Vista Grove folks are familiar with Tommy as he is a member and frequent contributor to the life and faith at Knox Presbyterian Church. Tommy served as a missionary in Spain for 7 years before he returned to the United States to complete his doctorate at Duke University. An internet search reveals little-known details, such as not only is he a pastor's kid, he is a fierce pillow fighter, he likes to surf, and is dad to 4 children. Let us welcome Dr. Tommy Givens.
Well, good afternoon. Great to be with you all. Thank you for the kind invitation to join you, and it's great to see a lot of familiar faces from Knox and elsewhere, so it's an honor to join you. It is true, I guess, what you found buried on the internet, fathering 4 children and lots of other craziness in my life, so I don't know, maybe that'll find its way into our conversation. But I am here at, I guess, Terry's initial invitation, but yours, I hope, as well, to talk with you about this pregnant and provocative phrase that we get in Matthew's gospel from Jesus to give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. And of course, I'm thinking about this after the election that we have all endured over the past many months. And after an election like that, it is tempting, I think, to hide in the conceit, especially if you're someone like me teaching Bible at a seminary, to hide in the conceit that what you do is not really related to politics. But if you read the Bible with any care, you know that you can't, in fact, afford any such conceit as much as you might like to hide that way. Because the Bible is, in fact, full of how God's revelation engages the struggle among human beings for power, and what that reveals about us, and how God's call comes to us amidst that struggle, not to pretend that we're not involved in it, but to follow Jesus in the way that we engage in it. So that's what sort of prompted the topic for today. And I told Terry that I just don't really have it in me to monologue at you guys for the full 45 minutes. Something tells me that wouldn't be that enjoyable for you either. So I'll try to get some things on the table, but I hope that we can move pretty swiftly to some interaction between us and among us, because I would love to hear your questions and comments and concerns about this topic, particularly as I may give rise to them with what I have to say. So, I think I wasn't planning on being preceded by this hymn, which was a great choice, and in some ways might have made my job a little bit easier. It offers us maybe an initial interpretation of these words in Matthew, and so I'm glad for us to be kind of guided by that. But as we get into it and maybe think about how it relates to some of the challenges that we're all facing in the society that we're a part of, I want to try to frame the tensions of this passage a little bit for us so that we might get a feel for what's at stake in this encounter between Jesus and some of the most trusted authorities of his people. We've tended to demonize the Pharisees in a lot of the Christian tradition, something I hope that we feel at least some hesitation about, because if you consider Pharisaic teaching, in Jesus' day, you'll see that it actually has a lot in common with Jesus. And in many ways, Jesus' teaching was a brother to that of Pharisaic teachers of his day. But as brothers often do, they fight. And Jesus contends with some of the people that otherwise he might share the most with when it comes to God's calling upon the people of Israel, on what their light to the peoples of the world is to be about, what their hope for the future is. These are things that Jesus shares, frankly, with a lot of Pharisee teachers of his day. Nevertheless, they are threatened by Jesus. Throughout the drama of Matthew's gospel, we see that clash between Jesus and these and other authorities intensifying over the course of the story until Jesus has finally come to Jerusalem in the preceding scenes that we've pulled this section of Matthew from. He's come, as we're probably all familiar, to Jerusalem at Passover, crowds of his disciples hailing him as the Son of David, Jesus riding in, fulfilling this image from Zechariah of a king who would come to his people on a farm animal as opposed to on a war horse. Someone who would bring the kind of rule to his people that would actually bring an end to the use of the bow, Zechariah tells us. And so Jesus has made something of a parody of how kings often ride in to conquer the cities that they claim as their own by coming in on a donkey. And yet, he poses a significant threat. Masses of people are following Jesus, altering their lives because of what he has taught, joining his group of disciples. And increasingly, this presents an enormous challenge to the established powers of his day. They grow alarmed, understandably so. And so as Jesus is teaching in the courts of the temple, they begin to send emissaries, partisan representatives, representatives of Sadducees, of Herodians, of Pharisees, of scribes, of chief priests, some of the main sort of groups that govern Israel's life in the land from Jerusalem. And they send these emissaries to ask questions to Jesus that they hope will expose him in some way. I assume during our recent political campaign, you had to listen or watch to some interviews or the press gathering around a candidate, asking them a question that's very hard to answer, maybe baiting them in some way, trying to get a gaffe out of them that they could then disseminate and get lots of attention and maybe favor their candidate over the other or something like that. So it's something similar that's happening with these authorities and their representatives. They're attempting to derail Jesus in public by posing questions to him that, however he answers them, he will somehow destroy his political future, destroy the future that he seems to be headed towards with masses of people hailing him as the Son of David and entrusting their future to him and to his rule. So that's the kind of question that it is when these representatives of the Pharisees and Herodians, an unlikely alliance, by the way, we might want to come back to that, come to him and say, "Tell us, Jesus, we know you're a great guy. We know that you don't sort of cower before anyone. You're not deferential. You'll say the truth no matter how hard it hurts." Can you feel them sort of setting him up? So here we are, we're all listening with bated breath, Jesus. Is it legal to pay a tax to the foreign pagan emperor who is ruling our land, or is it not? Tough question. The song actually gives us a couple of options, right? One answer is sedition, it says in the first stanza. The other one is sin. I want to try to unpack those a little bit more. I don't think that's wrong, but I think we could put a little bit more flesh on that. So if Jesus answers no, it is not legal to pay a tax to Caesar, if he says that it is against God's law to pay that tax. It is indeed sedition, but we might even go a little bit farther. I would say that it is a declaration of war upon Rome that will activate a Roman military response. On what basis do I say that? Well, historically, the way that Rome relates to subject peoples is primarily through regimes of taxation, controlling their economy remotely so that Rome is able to control the distribution of power. Not 30 years before this, there was an uprising in Jesus' day. So this is just maybe actually right after Jesus was born. This took place in the year 6 AD. A rebellion led by a person named Judas the Galilean. It was a significant uprising. But do you know what their mantra was? We pay no taxes to any god other than our God. That was the rallying cry of this rebellion, and it produced a Roman imperial response, putting this rebellion down. This is a fresh memory for people of Jesus' day. And so they know that if Jesus says, no, we're not going to pay taxes to Rome, that what Jesus is in effect saying is, we are going to rise up and take up arms against Rome. Because this is how Rome regulates its control of subject peoples. If you pay taxes, then you don't have to deal with Roman oppression at least too directly, only through sort of the economy, some gentle policing maybe, that sort of thing. But if you refuse to pay tribute, then you can expect Roman legions to be making their way to your territory to ensure that whoever is ruling is sending the tribute to Rome as prescribed. So that's what happens if Jesus says, no, it's not legal to pay taxes to Caesar. What if Jesus says, yes, let's pay taxes to Caesar? The hymn that we sang calls that a sin. And I suppose that's right, but I think we got to go a little deeper than that. Can you imagine living as a Jewish person in Jesus' day with a Roman Empire that controls the movement of people through policing, through checkpoints, that controls the economy, especially the grain trade, that controls your right to assemble, that controls who is in the government and who is not? These are the kinds of powers that Rome exercises over the Jewish community living in Judea and Galilee. So to say, yes, it's legal to continue to pay taxes to this empire is to say, yes, we will continue to submit to Rome's dominance of our life. And you can imagine how well that's going to go over for Jewish people who are at Passover celebrating their liberation as a people from foreign imperial rule in Egypt. To hear from Jesus that we're just going to keep submitting to that, and that's God's calling on our life, is a surefire way to end Jesus' rise to power. So can you see how the authorities that have asked this question to Jesus in public have backed him into a corner? What is he going to say? Well, you remember what he does from the story as we've read. He asks for a coin. Turns out this would be a denarius, the coin that amounts to a day's wages. If you're a day laborer, what you would make usually for working in the fields for a day is 1 denarius. And usually that's enough to feed maybe 1 or 2 people for that day. So it's not a very living wage, but it's how people eke by. And this is the coin that is used to pay the tax to Caesar. And so Jesus asks whose image is pictured here on this coin. And of course they answer, it's Caesar's image. And so Jesus says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. Now, on its face, this might seem relatively straightforward, but I think it is not quite so straightforward as we might imagine. I assume many of us have heard this line sort of trotted out in our lives all the time, as if what Jesus were doing was drawing a nice, neat line between religion and politics. So that whatever the political authorities tell you to do, you've got to submit because that's human government. And whatever God asks you to do, your religious commitments, well, you owe that to God. But those don't have to conflict with each other. Y'all heard that kind of an interpretation? I find that often comes from people who are relatively supportive of the government where they live. The problem with that is the same person, Jesus, who says these words, is the one who just a few days later gets himself crucified, executed publicly by the Roman Empire for sedition, for leading a political rebellion as a king. So if Jesus was saying, we keep the government happy by doing what they want, and we keep God happy by doing the separate things that God wants, he didn't do a very good job living up to what he said. Because it turns out that what he did and the way that he lived actually exerted pressure on the Roman Empire, Pilate specifically, so that he felt the need to deal with this threat by publicly evacuating Jesus of power by torturing him to death in open shame. This is the way Rome tries to suffocate political rebellion, by shaming a head of a movement and totally emptying them of power to disband whatever movement was following them. But the only reason that happened was that Jesus actually posed some kind of threat to the political powers, including Rome, of his day. So whatever Jesus means, it's not do whatever Caesar wants. Because had he meant that, then he wouldn't have died the way that he did. Nor would he have a bunch of apostles then writing letters from jail either. So how are we going to make sense of this? Well, what is it that human beings are supposed to give to God? He's actually said this in some of everything, right? He said this in some of the earlier scenes of this same story. To give to God what God calls upon us is to give God the love of our heart, our soul, our mind, our strength, absolutely everything that we are, all that we are. This is what God calls upon us to give. And this entails what we do with our wealth. It involves what we do with our friendships. It involves how we relate to people that are hostile to us. God speaks to all of these matters, all of which are also the stuff of politics. And so Jesus is saying, I think, that God does make a political claim on our life. Because our life before God requires that we love God with everything that we are. And we do this especially, Jesus has taught us, by the way that we treat people around us, people that we bump into, people who are our neighbors that we're called to share our life with. So it seems like Jesus is saying something like the following. Rome has managed to relate to us by taxation. They use coins to project their power and to try to control the way that we live. Let's not be so foolish as to pretend that this is a good measure of our life. To find ourselves in a battle over a coin. If we measure our life in those terms, in the terms that Rome tries to use to measure our life, then we'll misrepresent who we are. Because our life can't actually be measured by coins. What's measured by this coin is the image of Caesar. So, give Caesar his stupid coins. But let's give to God everything that God calls upon us to give, which is all of our life. And as we do that, we will find that we are offering resistance to the Roman Empire and other kinds of power that attempt to coerce us and dominate us the way that they do. And as we continue to love God with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, all of our strength, to love our neighbor as ourself, we will claim for our life enough that Caesar won't be left with anything to take from us. It will be very difficult to measure our life with coins if we love one another that way. That, I think, is the kind of tension that Jesus is urging people to embrace. To not allow taxation to be the flashpoint that we use to measure who we are. That will cheapen us. But to continue to resist this power that attempts to claim our life by refusing to give it all that it claims, and instead to love God with all that we are. And over time to watch what that does to Rome's reach and control of our life. And as we follow this story forward, which I'm sure the audience of Matthew's gospel has already been witnessing, it turns out that the name of Jesus, the memory of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus after he's raised from among the dead, begins precisely to claim so much of people's lives, not only in Judea and the Galilee, but around the Roman world and beyond, to the point that Rome is increasingly threatened by seeing that the way that people are living in the Roman Empire is no longer serving the gods and the lords of Rome. This is partly what eventually arouses persecution and repressive measures to try to control this Christian movement. You could talk, if you want to, later about letters that we have from senators writing to emperors in the 2nd century saying, what do we do? Our pagan shrines are emptying. People are not giving of their offerings, their lives to our gods. They're not honoring the imperial family. They're following this Christian cult and honoring the God of this people that we've conquered supposedly in the eastern part of the empire, but whose God is now conquering us by claiming the people that are living in our lands. This is what you find Pliny the Younger in today's Turkey writing to Trajan, emperor in the 2nd century AD. It's just to illustrate that what Jesus says does in fact play out over the subsequent generations, that by not allowing Rome to control how the Jewish community lives through taxation, but instead insisting on loving God with all that they are, they begin to claim for themselves the control of their life that Rome had once claimed from them. But this is about loving God with all that they are. It's not about their ability to withhold taxes or to marshal military might to try to free themselves by those means. That's what they don't do, following Jesus. So these are I think, the tensions that are at play in this passage. And I think before I invite questions or responses from you, I want to hazard a comparison to what I have felt in this recent political campaign. Now, I was born in the mid-'70s, so you all are familiar with a longer political history in the U.S. than I am. But it does seem to me like in the last couple of election cycles, especially with the new media environment that we're all living in, I'm not sure how many of you are on social media, but that there is an enormous amount of pressure on people to present who they are, what they stand for in this world, in relation to one of two candidates or one of two parties that we are offered. We know that our political system is awash with mammon. There are massive amounts of money coursing through political campaigns, political candidates. Not everyone is able to furnish the candidates that they would like in our elections. We're all sort of left to choose from among those that are put forward for us, and then asked to see ourselves entirely in one or in the other. And we sort of polarize these people so that they become choices between light and darkness, life and death. And it seems to me like the effect of this sort of electoral system is to cheapen who people actually are, to cheapen what each one of you and what I am as a person, who we are as communities of people. It just does not seem to me that you know a person very well simply in terms of who they voted for in the recent national election. As troubling as it was for me to see some of the campaigning, and as strongly as I felt about the campaign and the outcome, it just doesn't seem to me that this is a good device for measuring who people are. And yet, as I watched people submitting their sort of social media posts as they were voting on the day of the election, that's how we're invited to present it. This is what I stand for in this world. This is everything that I'm about. As if a political system like ours were capable of actually representing people in all of their richness, in all of their particulars, in all of the challenges and the dreams and difficulties of their life in terms of a vote that you can count. It seems to me the Bible warns us again and again about counting people, about counting power. It tells us that the best things in this world are countless. They're things that you can't count. What will the descendants of Abraham be like? Like the stars in the sky, like the sands of the seashore. Not something that you can put a number to. But votes are things that you can count. And I'm not counseling that we avoid that system, but I am counseling that we think hard about whether or not this is actually a good representation of who we are, and allowing that to dictate how we see one another and how we treat one another. Because it seems to me that it lays the groundwork for deep divisions, an inability to communicate with each other, to hear where one another is coming from, to hear why people are concerned or worried about the things that they are. Instead, we quickly brand people as belonging to the right side or the wrong side, voting for the right candidate or the wrong candidate in this or that election. So as strongly as I feel about the candidates and which is a better way forward, I hope that we're, as Christians, mindful of how we can be seduced in the same way that I would say Jesus was being tempted to be seduced into defining the terms of Israel's life, into defining the terms of our life according to a system that is controlled so heavily by money, controlled so heavily by geopolitical military power. It's not clear to me that those are the terms in which we want to know ourselves. God calls us, it seems to me, to a life that is richer than that, one in which we're learning to love God with all that we are, not just with a vote, to love one another for all that each of us is, not just according to a partisan affiliation or which candidate that we have voted for. It seems to me like the effect of that will be to degrade the fabric of who we are. So that's broadly what I want to share with you, but I imagine I've raised questions or comments. Objections are welcome as well, of course. So Karen, I don't know if you are going to pass the mic around, but I'd love to hear from you what your response or your concerns about this subject are.
I'd be glad to have someone speak. Aha, Lynn.
So what does that look like in the day-to-day? Jesus, he turned tables over in the temple. He called people names that probably we wouldn't print in the news these days. I mean, he was not always, he wasn't always meek and mild, and he got angry. And so what does that look like when one lives in a system where there is such clear evil at play?
Yeah. Great question. I think what it looks like broadly is the pursuit of a community of people's loving one another where people live. So Jesus doesn't sort of divide people into good and bad, who's on the right side, who's on the wrong side. Instead, what he does is cultivate a life of sharing tables with each other, sharing places with each other across significant, even abysmal divisions. Those are even within his own disciples, right? He's got someone who's called a zealot and someone who's called a tax collector. These would be opposing factions, somehow learning to share the same table, share the same life with each other. So I think that what Jesus teaches us in terms of the day-to-day is to be pursuing a life of communicating meaningfully with the people that we share our places with, learning how to share the abundance of our places if we have that. if there is scarcity and difficulty, sharing those wounds and shortcomings with each other as well. And occasionally that will lead to acts of protest like you have with Jesus. It's not about pursuing community in a way that leaves the powers as they are. But the key is Jesus' protest in the temple, for example, is directed against authorities who are making a show of worshiping God, but hiding a way of governing people that is systematically exploiting people, especially the weak. And he's been teaching against that publicly throughout his entire life to that point. So the pursuit of a shared life with each other, meaningfully looking your neighbor in the eye, getting to know what their difficulties and their hopes and their dreams are, and building a life together. That's not about settling for the status quo or not criticizing a government. Jesus clearly does criticize the government of his day and refuses the status quo. But the way that he engages in that pursuit is by building communities of people who are investing their lives in each other and allowing that to be what applies pressure on the governing forces of his day. This is distinct from simply saying, without building that sort of community together, we are going to oppose the empire by withholding taxes. Like, part of the challenge when you oppose the empire through military means is, what community do you have even if you win the war? Like, what's the aftermath of that resistance like? Israel, as we know from the Old Testament, is the product of many revolutions. Winning the war for them was not the way to establish a durable, lasting peace, a quality community life with each other. That was something that is slow, hard, organic work, day to day, building those bonds with your neighbors where you live. So that seems to me to be what Jesus' political life, you might say, is fundamentally about. Investing in a community of people that are learning to love one another as neighbors across the immense differences and hostilities that they may have inherited, and confronting the barriers to that as they go. So that's what I think is the focus. A lot of times in Christian discipleship, we leave a lot of things out of that. One of the things that Jesus does, for example, is confront landowners of his day for the way that they are basically perpetuating a system of debt. And he calls upon them to forgive those debts if they expect to enjoy God's forgiveness themselves. So Jesus is involved in a sort of redistribution of wealth. He's involved in confronting authorities that are favoring some at the expense of others. That's the day-to-day work that we see Jesus doing, all the while, by the way, having a party. He's enjoying celebrating good meals with friends, with others, sometimes with people that are a little suspicious, that he accepts their invitation to join them at their table, whether it's Simon the Pharisee in Luke 8, or Levi the tax collector, Matthew, in Matthew chapter 9. Jesus joins them and promotes the sort of hospitality where they can share a table with each other, even though at that table is often difficult conversation, sometimes pointed, sometimes embarrassing for some of the people present, especially powerful people. So it's not a matter of shying away from difficulty, but it's recognizing that it is easy for us to give in to systems that are going to simply pit us against each other or pit us against a remote authority, whether it's Washington, whether it's Rome, as if opposing them is going to fix all of our problems, rather than recognizing that there are significant difficulties that we have the power to address where we live, in the places that we are, by learning to love God with all that we are, where we are. So that seems to me to be the way Jesus approaches the challenges of the day-to-day. And he's warning his people against being seduced into thinking there's some shortcut to addressing all of that by simply withholding taxes from Rome and thinking that's going to solve something. You want to follow up? Yeah.
Sorry, it's me again.
No.
So it's a lot of lovely kumbaya, which we love and do a lot of that around here.
Yeah.
Come January 20th, what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I imagine that it's got to look like 1,000 different things. So I don't want to be overly general, but I would say there's been a lot of attention, for example, with the incoming administration towards migrants, towards what to make of the border of the United States along the south. And I would say that Christians should be people who are less concerned about policing that border. Not that they're not concerned at all about that, but less concerned about that than they are about caring for the neighbors that they have among themselves who might be slated for coercive removal under the incoming administration. So if you're going to love your neighbors where you live, it means you're not going to withhold that love because of what documents people have or what origin that they have or some other way that we have of classifying them. That could mean that you're going to hide people sometimes from forces that would seek to remove them forcibly. It could mean that you're going to organize to provide for them if it becomes difficult for them to sustain themselves. If we deny them the ability to work, for example, for their life. So instead of just sitting back and watching them suffering, those of us who enjoy being enfranchised with citizenship, I would think this means insisting that their wounds are our wounds, that their scarcity is our scarcity, that we are not comfortable enjoying some abundance while they are stuck with lack. So that's just one very concrete issue that I suspect with the incoming administration that we might face. And I hope that the Christian community would feel called to stand between a government that would want to forcibly remove some of their neighbors and between those people to enable them to have a future where they are. So that's just one example.
Some good news from Monte Vista Grove. The numbers of us have been asking these sorts of questions, and I bring good news that the board has decided here that we will, because we have 5 DACA staff members here, and that we are offering immigration legal advice and counsel, and that we are committing ourselves to do all we can to do just as you have asked. And so I trust us as a community to be able to do those sorts of things. I just want to do more.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's just talk about that. Let's stay on that issue, and we can talk about another one too. Just sticking with the kind of theme that I'm trying to develop here. It would be easy, right, for us to sit in our armchairs and castigate the government that is engaged in persecuting immigrants and to do next to nothing ourselves to get out of our chairs, to move our bodies, to mobilize our resources, to provide some kind of protection that we do, in fact, have some power to provide. And that, I think, is partly what Jesus is warning against some kind of easy criticism from a distance that doesn't act upon the sort of grievance that we're saying that we have. It's become very popular, it seems to me, to be very negative about political officials. And it's not that they don't deserve it. It's that a lot of times it's empty rhetoric on our part and makes us feel like we're doing a lot when I'm not sure that we really are. So in this case, what I'm trying to encourage is, by all means, there will be times when we need verbally to say, this sort of government is bad and we oppose it. But those words have power, usually, if we're doing something with our bodies that's backing up those words. When all we're doing is just spewing the words, then I feel like what it does is just sort of bounce off the powers that be as the sort of expected, whatever, complaints from whatever sector of the population that they expect them from. We could think of other measures that are maybe not so straightforward in terms of following Jesus and some of the concrete challenges that he's encouraging in his own generation. I mentioned, for example, that what a lot of people don't realize about Jesus' movement is that it is engaged in a systematic redistribution of wealth. The fact that you might have inherited a great deal of land in Jesus' day and have a bunch of people working on that land doesn't mean that you're entitled by God to just maintain that situation. The fact that you're enjoying abundance at the expense of so many people who are barely making a denarius a day is something Jesus says is a calling upon you to forgive the debts that they're paying off instead of maintaining that status quo. So we're going to inherit with the incoming administration all kinds of unequal wealth that we're all a part of in any number of ways. And I suspect that with the incoming administration, we will be encouraged to think that whatever we have inherited is ours by right. Whatever we've worked to achieve over the course of our life and the system that we have is ours by right. But it seems to me that Jesus has been teaching his people, those who are following him as disciples, that that's not the case. That what we're after is a life together where people are not living at each other's expense. And that means that those of us who have inherited more are looking for ways to redistribute what we have inherited so that we don't perpetuate this cycle over generations. There's no easy way to do that, but there are lots of good ideas. There are ways of investing, for example, in small businesses of people who don't have the capital to be able to get something like that off the ground and could really use a sizable free loan, or maybe not a free loan, but a grant to be able to get that small business off the ground that they would never have the credit to be able to achieve. That's the way you forgive intergenerational debts rather than simply maintaining them. So that would be an example, I think, that follows what you see Jesus teaching his generation and his disciples to do. And we will be given, our current system gives us all kinds of incentives to simply cling to what we already have and to try to grow our own pile. And what Jesus calls upon us to do is to not settle for that arrangement, but to be thinking creatively and assertively about how we can leave something better to those who are going to inherit our places from us than what we came to ourselves. So that would be another concrete way that I think we could work for something better. And if we share those stories, I think that people will sometimes feel confronted by that. You can imagine meeting some resistance. And I think that's exactly what you see happening in the Gospels. Okay.
Thank you so much for this very thoughtful presentation.
Yeah.
We've all preached this text many times before.
Yeah.
I, for one, would like to go back and rewrite my sermon on that one.
There's so many sermons that I would like to rewrite
Oh,
already.
my. Oh,
yes.
my.
Yes.
Long ago and far away, I served with the Mennonites in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And they were trying to positively protest the industrial military complex, as
Yeah.
Eisenhower would say. And they actually calculated the percentage of their taxes that went to military.
Mm-hmm.
And they withheld something like 53% of their taxes. And they were garnered
Uh-huh.
Later.
Yeah.
But that was their way of protesting. We're all coming up toward April 15th.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about withholding taxes?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question because I think today we need to recognize that our withholding taxes is not necessarily a declaration of war against the United States or even against the state of California or wherever our taxes are going. It's obviously the federal tax revenue that would be going to military forces. So, oh yeah, it's insane. It's just crazy. Yeah. Yeah. And so I guess what I'm coming around to saying is I do think there's a good case for Christians gathering together and thinking creatively about how and why they might either withhold a portion of the taxes that they owe and make clear why they're doing that publicly and require the government to come and garnish their wages to be able to reclaim that money if that's what they're going to do. That's not the only way to do it. There are other ways as well. In Spain, where I used to live, for example, they managed to pass a law that enabled you as a private citizen to classify the part of your tax revenue that would go to the military of the country of Spain to be redirected to a number of approved receiving bodies that were engaged in social uplift, etc. And the government retained the authority to take that money and to allocate it to the military anyway. But that was always a public issue. And so it forced the government again and again to have to make the case to the citizens for why they're spending the amount of money that they are on the military forces of Spain. And that put political pressure on the federal government of Spain that I think was really positive. And it also encouraged people to learn about where their tax dollars were going and to demand accountability for that. So in that case, people paid the same amount of money that they would have paid anyway, but they filed their taxes in a way that classified part of what they paid as designated for a certain number of approved charities, and then they expected the government to honor that, and when the government didn't honor that, which the government was allowed not to, then they were allowed to make a public campaign about that, to call attention to the way that the government was not honoring what they were giving tax dollars for, and to make public what the government's priorities were. And you see, one of our problems right now is a lot of that is totally opaque to it. We have no idea. It's just a crazy, overwhelming numbers game. So trying to bring this into view of the public so that it is under public scrutiny, I think would be another way, even on the issue of taxes, to deal with this kind of difficulty. The thing that I guess I want us to remember is that in different sort of groups where we find ourselves, we're going to have different inspiration and different possibilities. So I don't want to oversimplify what the alternatives are. You might think that instead of withholding taxes that would be going to military, that would be spent, say, for an invasion of Gaza, be spent for a campaign in Ukraine, be spent for probably conflicts that are coming in Syria and other parts of the world, that there are ways that you want to invest resources that you have in those places of the world that might be a better way of addressing the difficulties that those populations are facing than a military response. So you're not necessarily withholding taxes, but you're investing in alternatives to military attempts to solve what militaries don't solve very well. So that would be another way. And I think this is what Christians are called to do, is to think creatively together. When we feel a sense of calling, like it sounds like you have with 5 DACA, workers here at Monte Vista Grove, this is something that touches us. So we have emotional energy, we have some power, some resources. How can we get organized and act? So that, I think, is what Christian communities are called to do wherever they live, and to take seriously the things that you see with your own eyes, what you encounter with your own body, as opposed to assuming that you've got to learn about what you're supposed to do politically only through remote media or things that are happening far away. We don't want to neglect those things, but I think, especially I'm noticing with younger generations, we often feel very powerless to do anything about things that are so far away. And it's crucial to give people the opportunity to work on something that they see all the time, that they're encountering in their everyday life, and to invest in reform there, because then over time there are often tangible results. Doesn't always solve the whole problem, but you can see that what you're doing is making a difference. And I think that's important, especially for young people today, but really for all of us, so that we're not, I'm sensitive to the tendency that we have conveniently to work on faraway crises while we ignore all the problems that are right on our doorstep, and then patting ourselves on the back for money we're sending to missionaries like Tommy in Spain, while we're ignoring all kinds of things that are around the corner. We don't want to do that. So that's why whatever we're going to do remotely, I hope it's complemented by what we're doing in our own neighborhood, in our own place. Thank you for the question. Great one. Hi.
Pat, and then
Pat?
Judy. I hope I can frame this the way I intend to. As you're talking about making the difference between having our argument with faraway authorities and the people near us, having a different kind of relationship. The thing that I'm aware of is that those faraway authorities take leadership in a nation, and they promote certain ideas and certain activities that are with the people that are among us, with the people at our church.
Yeah.
So it's not like we have that choice, that we're
Right.
going to pay attention just to the people around us.
Right.
In the LA Times today, there was an article about a huge jump in this county, 1 year over the next, in hate crimes. Hate crimes about immigrants or people that they assume are immigrants, people who are lesbian and gay and trans. There were a couple of other groups,
Yeah.
Jews, of course,
Yeah.
lots of targeting of them. And those are being carried out by people that we know.
Right.
And yet, we can be open to the woundedness of the people that we know.
Yeah.
And develop some sense of where they might be coming from. Maybe they wouldn't do that to some other group,
Yeah.
but they feel free to do it to that group
Yeah.
because they're hearing that from their leadership.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I want to mention.
Yeah.
And
It's
that's
a good
the main
observation.
thing. But I do want to mention one other thing.
I'm still
that
with
I
you.
can just put on there for you.
Yep.
And that is that I don't think that you can weigh evenly the idea that if some policy isn't working for a whole lot of people, like it's causing more poverty.
Yeah.
That we can just take up our creative efforts and help with this person and that person. Those are not equal. Those are
True.
not equal.
Yeah.
Policy covers all the people for the common good.
Yeah.
We can do our little part, but it does not make the same difference as national and local policies
Yeah.
that work for the common good.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. I think two great points and maybe correctives to impressions that I've given. First of all, you're right that with what's going on in the Middle East, for example, a steady uptick in hate crimes against Jews is going to be something that's not just arising locally, but from rhetoric and other things that are coming out of remote national centers of power. So however remote they seem, they're acting on our neighbors, whether animating them or victimizing them in these kinds of exchanges. So what I want to say is, let's not neglect that. Do we need to agitate for federal policy kinds of change or changes in rhetoric and the way conflict in the Middle East is presented? Yes. But what I don't want to do is to limit ourselves to that. In Los Angeles, we are surrounded by Jewish people. We've got one of the highest concentrations of Jewish people in the entire country. So surely one of the things that we would want to be doing is encouraging more good communication with Jewish people among whom that we live, at the same time that we're agitating for high-level changes in remote centers of power. What I'm worried about is the tendency to only do the latter, to assume that simply by attacking the remote sort of center of power where there's a problem coming from, that we're going to generate enough energy to be able to prevail and to overwhelm what is a bad policy. It seems to me that what gives efforts at reform their power is not just people speaking out towards something remote, but they're people who are feeling in their bones because of their life experience, the people that they're encountering, what they are calling out. It's not just a theoretical problem. It's something they're living in the flesh, or people close to them are living. And that, it seems, that's what I want to encourage, is that we've got to do both at the same time. One of the ways we can be seduced, I think, in our system is because we know the policies are being made out there, that we assume the primary place to concentrate all of our efforts at reform is out there, rather than recognizing that what's made that possible is partly the way that people like you and me are living in our places every day. So that's what I want to encourage, is people taking local responsibility for what they are advocating even at great distances, rather than thinking that these don't have anything to do with each other. On the other, you're absolutely right that what we might be able to do creatively in an ad hoc way in the places that we are certainly does not have the power that long-established policy has, that has the force of, say, the federal government behind it or something like that. So there's no, hopefully, false equivalence being made here. But again, I don't know how often you've seen this to happen. We have a lot of good laws that are on the books that don't actually get enforced because people where they live don't even know that those are laws, policies that were made once upon a time, but were not implemented. Authorities were not taking them up. People were not denouncing when they were being denied. And so it's a formal law that doesn't have any force on the ground. So what I'm wanting to encourage is not a false equivalence between our local creative efforts and what's happening at higher levels of policy, as you say, but a recognition that what gives policy its force over time is the way that people actually live in concrete places. And we don't want to ignore that connection. The way that you and I live today can have an effect on what becomes policy in 20 years. What we've inherited as policy today is partly what's made possible by how everyday people live in their places over decades before we've come to our time. So that's what I'm trying to keep that circle alive, to recognize that these influence each other. But certainly, if what you want to make sure I'm emphasizing or gets emphasized better is we do have to recognize that some of the challenges that we're facing politically are taking place at high levels of power, where we do need our representatives to advocate. We do need public witnesses whose voices are being heard in the halls of power and to agitate for changes at that level. So by all means, when it comes to education in the state of California, you're going to need people with LA Voice going up to Sacramento to speak with the governor's office, to offer protest where need be, and to actually effect change at the level of, in this case, state education policy. We could say something similar about the federal government. My concern is that our ability to effect large-scale political change these days often assumes that we can just go do that even if we're not engaged in the sort of life where we live that is congruent with the high-level change that we're advocating for. We could say the same thing about ecology. This would be another area of concern for me. I mean, we live basically in a desert here in Los Angeles, but a lot of us enjoy golf. And we're pretty oblivious to where our water comes from. We tend to measure it by the water bill, as opposed to thinking about what's the source of that water. Whether I have enough money to pay for it or not is not really the question. It's more, is it a responsible and sustainable use of this God-given gift? So I can agitate for a sound use of our water might be Pasadena Water and Power. They've gotten more than one letter from me. It might be LA Department of Water and Power. It might be the projects for bringing water from the Delta across the Central Valley of California to Los Angeles. We can do all of that. But if you're doing that and you're not paying attention to where the water you put in your body comes from and how it gets there, then it seems to me that we will not be as articulate or motivated or passionate enough to produce large-scale, high-level policy change about what we do with water in the state of California or the western United States, that's flowing down the watershed from the Rocky Mountains, et cetera. So part of what I see Jesus criticizing a lot is the kind of hypocrisy in the leaders of his day who are very vocal about certain things that people need to do at a kind of high policy level and don't lift a finger to do it themselves with the small scale affairs that they control. And that's what I want us to work against, and instead to recognize that we're implicated personally and on very small scales in the kinds of changes that we're called to engage even at high levels, and we'll be more powerful and I think more faithful witnesses to Jesus if what we're advocating for on those higher levels is consonant with what we're doing with our own bodies, with our neighbors where we live. Does that make sense?
Judy Dirt has a question.
Thank you, Pat.
Thank you so much
2
for
points.
today. And I also want to thank you for being a professor who teaches and stands up for the fact that what Jesus teaches affects our politics.
Yeah.
And that is something that we all have to remember. I think there are some circles in which it takes courage to do that, and I
Sure.
thank you for that.
Yeah.
My question comes from something that was triggered in me when you talked about Jesus' anger at the worship in the temple
Yeah.
and the turning over of the money
Yeah.
changers'
Yeah.
tables. And I'm thinking about the church. And one thing that is beginning to, I haven't looked at this. I have a husband who's interested in these kind of analytics, that the election of the people who are going to come into power was largely fueled by Christians. And a particular group of Christians who I might call Christian nationalists.
Yeah.
And there are people moving into the administration who say this needs to be a Christian nation,
Yeah.
and we will enforce that.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you see, and how would you suggest that the church that would take a different position can and should or might address those churches that insist that this needs to be a Christian nation and who are insisting on the power
Yeah.
to take over,
Yeah.
power of Jesus?
Yeah. Great question. And your account of this recent election strikes me as correct. That a large part of the movement in favor of the incoming administration is Christian, and people who understand that what they're doing is advocating for the Christianization of the entire United States. What do we think of that? What do we do about that? Let me start with a temptation that I want to say we should not engage in. As tempting as it is even for me, and it builds on what we've been talking about today. The temptation, I think, is to simply form our own equal and opposite base, where we just try to strengthen our own alternative vision to that and speak in opposition all the time, right, to a movement of Christian nationalism, and find ourselves demonizing what we're doing, what they're doing, telling everyone repeatedly that this is the work of the devil, something along those lines. It strikes me that just sets us up for ongoing antagonism and not a lot of meaningful communication. So this is where I get a little bit worried about partisan platforms, because the tendency is simply to define yourself in opposition to the terms of your opponents. And the result is not learning to understand where people are coming from and to see if we can find a better way forward together, but simply entrenching ourselves into sort of opposing sides. So, I come from a background like that. These are still people that I have connections with, how I was raised. And it strikes me that they have developed their own way of anticipating the talking points of opponents and simply reasserting their own. And I would say we want to defuse that. We don't want to simply fuel that antagonism. Instead, let's try to go back to what our shared sense of calling is as Christians. This is a matter, I think, of slow, difficult work, of not hewing to the familiar sort of points of contestation, but asking harder and deeper questions about what does it mean to be a Christian? What are we called to do? How do we make sense of Scripture together? How do we make sense of this story? How do we make sense of that story? Maybe it doesn't line up with either partisan platform, but calls us both to something deeper that we hadn't seen before, and that's something that we can discover only together. At Fuller, every Tuesday and Thursday morning, this is how Terry and I have been getting to know each other. You know, we listen to Scripture for just an hour together. And we don't have anybody teach us a lot about it. We just listen to it together. And then we drink coffee and eat breakfast burritos over what we've heard. And the purpose is not to rush to analysis, not to rush to what our talking points are, but just to sit there in silence and to let the Scripture wash over us for a full 60 minutes. And then to see what percolates to the surface when we're sitting around the table sipping coffee and eating burritos afterwards. And to allow ourselves to consider different forms of alignment, different ways of seeing ourselves, feeling how we're challenged ourselves with what we've heard that day, rather than just being given more fuel to prosecute the war politically that we're already committed to. So that strikes me as really important. I want to argue, for example, from Scripture for a form of society that does not think that coercing people into Christianity is the way forward for the faith. That what we find in Scripture is a witness that attempts to model what the gifts of God are for our life, and to make room for people to think differently and to live differently, and to recognize that in shared spaces we're going to have to negotiate things. What our public school curriculum is, how we think about the medical establishment, that we're not going to be able to simply give our own Christian reasons for those things, but recognize that we share our place with people who come from different backgrounds, and we're always going to be involved in negotiating what is livable for us as neighbors. This would be basically a commitment to Christian pluralism, right, rather than Christian nationalism. But you can see how that will create immediate reactions in some of our opponents. And rather than just hiding, behind our castles and throwing stones, what I'm calling for us to do is to find places where we can gather, and not to make concessions, not necessarily even to make compromises, but to try to hear from one another. What are you worried about? What are you afraid of? Why do you think this way? Let me tell you what I'm worried about, why I think the way that I do, and to see what possibilities emerge. Going back to Pat's question, historically this is very difficult if you're trying to do it on TV, right? Or if you're trying to do it on Facebook. If you're trying to do it at a very sort of large scale, where all you can do is sort of think in broad platforms. I'll tell you guys a story.
And then we need to quit after your story.
All right, Karen, thank you. A story of mine from when I was at Duke. So I did my doctoral work at Duke, and my focus was Christian ethics, did a lot of Bible, and I took a seminar in radical political economy. And my professor told us that he shared the political science department with 2 members of the Bush White House, even though his own sort of political orientation was quite different and opposed to them. And that when, as a department, they got together to discuss national policy, it was very difficult for them to find any convergence, any way forward. It just seemed like they were diametrically opposed. And yet, when they turned to talk about where they should build the movie theater in Durham, or what they should do about the homeless man Joe that they all passed on their way to the work out of the parking lot every day. They seemed to have some shared ideas about what might be good for the place where they were living. And talking through those challenges that they were dealing with in their own bodies, then sometimes opened up their imagination for different ways of thinking about some of the problems, even at a national scale. That didn't solve everything. It just illustrates that a lot of times when we're sort of opposing one another as massified movements, it's very difficult to find a way forward. And so what we want to do is to try to break those scales down and to try to meet people where they're at and to share our experiences and our places with each other and allow that to be food for our imagination together, both locally and then at higher levels of power, regionally, nationally, internationally as well. I don't think we have to choose between those. I think we need both of those kinds of ways of negotiating the hostilities that we have in our time. Thank you for having me, you all.
Thank you
Great
very
to
much, Tommy.
talk with you.
And I don't know, are you planning to join
I'm staying for
people
dinner.
for dinner? So
Yeah,
the conversation...
if I upset you with what I said, sit at my table and
Right.
let's talk
It
about
will be at the back of the dining room at Rendezvous. And I want to announce that next week for our Convocation, Nancy Mackey will be leading us in a reader's theater that will be a very different ilk and equally inspiring. I also wanted to mention for you that the Knox immigration team had a conversation Monday night as we met, and we were reminded that in our denomination, although we come as a just war church historically, that at the end of the 1980s, a paper was produced by the General Assembly and accepted called Christian Obedience in a Nuclear Age, so that those people who are Presbyterians who might want to withhold part of their taxes, that was about nuclear issues, it might be about military, there is a place and affirmation and support for that, just like there is for conscientious objectors. You may want to review that paper, CONA, Christian Obedience in a Nuclear Age. Go in peace.